Hello and welcome to the Remembering and ReEnchanting podcast, a production of the Sequoia Sammanvaya Studios. I am your host, Reverend Sara Jolena Wolcott. This podcast emerges from my own journey of remembering and reenchanting in our precarious times. For even amidst great unravelings, many of us are sensing and attending to the movement of spirit within and between disciplines and sectors, time and ecologies, mythos and analysis, decolonizing and song, religious expressions, and living wisdom. You are also feeling the call of the Spirit in ways that orient you and perhaps also your community towards our kinship with Earth, then you are in the right place. Hello, I'm so delighted to welcome to our podcast today my old friend Ben Allen, professor of mathematics at Emmanuel College. And they are interested in the connections between mathematics and the sciences, especially biology. And most of their work is around mathematical modeling to illuminate organisms, patterns, and behaviors that emerge from evolution. Ben reached out to me I guess a year ago after I had published a
Mhm.
little article about looking at evolution and looking at the immense diversity of sexuality and the queerness in the wider, more than human world, both in terms of evolutionary and contemporary. And they were like, "Hey, I've been doing a lot of research on this." I'm like, "Oh my goodness, I didn't know this." And we've been friends since we were both at Haverford College together
That's right.
in our 20s. So Ben, I'm so glad to have you with us. It's so much fun to be able to have this conversation with an old friend that I hadn't even realized you were doing such cool research.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah. So you're a mathematician. You say mathematics
Mhm.
at Haverford. I was studying anthropology at the time. I feel like we're both with a focus on religion, and we're both. I haven't changed that much since then. Um, and I'd love to hear, like, you got into evolution, and you got into, like, the evolutionary of mathematics. So before we kind of get into, like, your core research areas and social cooperation and, queering evolution, can you, like, just help us orient us? Like, how can we think about, the process of studying evolution and the process of studying life, and especially from your perspective as a mathematician?
Right. Yeah. So I didn't start out to get into evolution. So when we were at Haverford, I was studying math from a very pure math point of view. I really felt like math was extremely beautiful. When I went into graduate school, that was still my focus is just understanding math in its purest form. But as I went through graduate school, it became more important to me to do things that had connections to the real world, and I stumbled on evolution as an area where um, really important both biologically and in our understanding of humans and our role in our world and something where math could be used to shed light on big theoretical questions in evolution. So, what I see as the role of math in this field is to test theory. So to understand like kind of verbal ideas about how we think evolution might works, to formalize them and say, do they really work? Do they really work the way that we think they do? Are some kind of nuances or caveats needed? Or can we use math to uncover some surprises, find some new
Mm.
predictions that maybe seem counterintuitive, but that the math shows are at least theoretically possible.
Hmm. And you got into social cooperation.
Yeah, so one of the big questions that really attracted me to the field in the first place is this question of when do organisms evolve to cooperate and when do they evolve to compete with each other? So there's this kind of cartoon idea of evolution as it's just, survival of the fittest, every organism out for themselves. They all, survive and reproduce to the extent that they can at the expense of others. But that's not really what happens in nature. We see lots of cooperation both within species and across species, sometimes on like individual in one organism to another, and sometimes on large scale behaviors like, bacteria forming biofilms or birds building massive communal nests, it's like the sociable weavers in South Africa. So there's a lot of instances of cooperation in nature as well as competition. And yeah, one of the big questions for me was, when do we get cooperation? Under what circumstances?
Mm.
And then so one of the answers to that is, if we have a population that's set up in a way where organisms get to consistently interact with a small number of neighbors, and those neighbors remain the same over time, even throughout generations as they're replaced by offspring, then we can get local scale cooperation where we kind of have pockets of cooperators that help each other, reinforce each other, and then that cooperative behavior can eventually spread throughout the population.
Mm. Hmm. The cooperative, can you say about the cooperative behavior spreading throughout the population?
Um, yeah, so I mean, these things spread locally.
Mm.
One dramatic example of this is bacteria sharing resources. So they can produce these chemicals that help them gather iron from the environment, which is a necessary element, and they can produce them in such a way that the iron that they gather isn't doesn't just go to the cell that produces the chemicals, but it goes to the neighboring cells as well, even in many cases largely to the neighboring cells. So this is a form of cooperation where they're producing something useful that benefits others, and you can see, do they under what circumstances does this kind of behavior evolve? And it tends to evolve more if we have bacterial colonies that are spread out over space, and where they're allowed to kind of interact with a small set of neighbors. But if we, grow them in a flask and shake that flask up regularly so that they're all kind of mixed together, those cooperative behaviors are much less likely to evolve.
Hmm. Hmm. And so when you're looking at that, like, you model, like, the different possibilities, is that right? Like, you use your mathematics to model, like, different variations of what could happen.
Exactly, right? So we can use math to essentially run instantaneous experiments. I don't need to go to a lab and, set up these bacteria or go out in the wild and observe chimpanzees. I can write down, like, in equations, a system of what would happen if we had organisms interacting like this. One of my persistent questions is, what if organisms are arranged on a network? They have neighbors in this network. They can interact with their neighbors and then occasionally replace their neighbors. Say when a neighbor dies, maybe there's an opportunity to produce offspring into that spot. Um, and we find that, on networks where there's a small number of neighbors, cooperation is much more likely to thrive than in a dense, interconnected network. This
Hmm.
is a mathematical prediction that we can get out of the theory that we can then go and, test with real world populations, either, microorganisms or, mammals, or in some cases, I think it applies to human behavior as well.
And just out of curiosity, like, how do you decide when, or how does it, not just you particularly, but the field as a whole, I think about jumping from, like, looking at organisms, like small organisms and microbes,
Mhm.
to, like, mammals and humans. Like, how do you, like, those are obviously big differences, and there might also be a lot of similarities. Like, how do you think about the complexity of that and how that changes this type of behavior?
Right. That's a really important question, because we don't just want to draw a straight line between, okay, other animals do this thing and therefore, primates and humans should as well. Humans have culture, right? We learn directly from each other in a way that maybe some animals do, but is certainly not the norm for the animal kingdom, and certainly not in microbes. So humans are, the most socially learning of all, that we know of life. And that's a distinct evolutionary process in itself. So we don't just evolve genetically by reproducing, but our ideas evolve as we learn from others. And some of these social learning processes can share some features in common with biological evolution. So
Mm.
if we're kind of interacting on, with friends, that kind of forms a social network, and we can absorb ideas from friends or learn from friends and then share those ideas to others in a way that's at least somewhat similar to how, organisms reproducing. But this analogy can also kind of, it's dangerous to take it too far and say like it's exactly the same kind of evolution because really these social evolution processes have their own important features that can be different.
Mm. I'm just, as I listen to you, I'm just really curious because I know that you're actually very involved in your local community in Boston and you're a musician and activist. Um, and I'm just like curious, like, has your work in looking at social cooperation, has that influenced your own personal like engagement in your own local community at all?
Yeah, well, I think it's really reinforced my belief that we need to be, building up connections with each other locally. Like if we want to do like important large scale activism, do we want to be, trying to shout our ideas out to everyone all at once? That might not be the best strategy. And certainly, from a theoretical perspective, having large scale networks in which everyone is, competing with everyone and everyone's trying to spread their ideas to everyone else, those tend to not produce cooperative behaviors. And I think that bears out in reality if we look at, large scale social networks. But if we're interacting with a consistent, relatively small set of neighbors, we can build up the cooperative ties that we need to then scale up from those local ties to some kind of large scale cooperation and, you know, even kind of, transitions to more communal mindsets.
Hmm. And are there any examples in the math or like or the biology of it happening in a different way, like not happening from local outwards, but from some other process?
Um, yeah, so if we're talking about evolution of cooperation, there's a
Okay.
number of different mechanisms that are studied to that promote cooperation. So on the biological level, interacting with relatives. So there's this, this theory that since we share genes, with our genetic relatives, then uh, cooperators are more likely to share genes with, their close relatives. And so we again get cooperators kind of mutually reinforcing each other. Or if we just have not necessarily local, but interactions that are repeated over time, then kind of mutual cooperation can evolve that way. People have also
Um,
studied reputation-based mechanisms where
yeah.
uh, there's kind of a social benefit to cooperating, in that cooperators are then kind of rewarded. Not in all cases, but I think this bears out at least some of the time that helping others can have its own social benefits, which then reinforces the cooperation.
Hmm, hmm. That's so interesting. I mean, it certainly like resonates with my own experience of how a lot of things work. Um, so when we're thinking about you're talking a lot about reproduction. So like w- can you tell us a little bit about like when you're thinking about like what is evolution?
Right. Yeah.
And like the
So
role of
evolution
reproduction.
is genetic change over time
It's genetic change over time.
in a
Um,
population, right? So we have a population. The members of the population reproduce somehow, and
mhm.
this reproduction is not always perfect, but can introduce some elements of change, and then these changes can then spread through reproduction, and this is what drives evolution.
Is that change is actually the change itself.
Well, the change is the evolution,
Uh,
and the drivers of this change are, reproduction, inheritance, and, mutation, or kind of imperfect inheritance.
mm, hmm. Is imperfect inheritance like an official phrase?
I don't know if it's an official phrase, but, I
Okay.
mean, if we the what's important is that there needs to be something passed on, but also a possibility of change. Right,
Mm,
if there's never any change, then we just get stagnation, but if nothing's passed on, then we don't really get evolution, then we just get kind of randomness, and so evolution is between those things where the reproduction in biological evolution, the reproduction is mostly faithful,
mhm,
uh in that, most of our genes, well, if we get into sexual reproduction, then we're combining genes from our two parents. And so that can create its own kind of variation. Um, but mutation, so introducing, new variants is relatively rare. It's important when it happens, but it's pretty rare in biological evolution.
mm. As you're talking about that, I'm just thinking about how one of the core tenets of in the field of religion is that and tradition is that a faith has is constantly changing and constantly trying to stay the same. It's always
Exactly.
adapting to its current times, and it's always trying to remain its traditional, um, historical, whatever, you know, process,
That's
whatever
exactly
its
right.
primary tenets of tradition are. And it's always a tension within the faith, like how much is innovation and how much is tradition, and knowing that you always have to respond to your times.
Right, I think that's a great parallel, that there has to be both continuity and change, and these things are always, like, a little bit in tension with each other, or maybe a lot
Mhm.
of it.
A lot of tension, yeah. And when you're talking about reproduc like, one of the intriguing things about when you take that you're taking and most people in your field and in biology, when they're talking about evolution, taking this huge perspective of reproduction. It's certainly not just, like, asexual reproduction, as you were just
Mhm.
mentioning.
Yeah,
And, like yeah, can you, like what are the different ty when scientists and mathematicians are talking about reproduction, what does that word mean? It doesn't
right. Yeah, so reproduction means, the genetic material, the heritable material from an organism is passed on to a different organism. And that can actually happen in a lot of different ways. So, we usually think about sexual reproduction where we have two parents and they, mix up their genes somehow and produce offspring that's some combination of the two. But a lot of organisms reproduce asexually, and this goes for microbes, but it also goes for, many vertebrates. So there's some reptiles, for example, lizards that can reproduce, what they call parthenogenically, meaning, without having sex. They just produce kind of clones of themselves. There's insects that can do that too. There's many organisms that can do both um, that can reproduce either sexually or asexually, and those, lead to different patterns of evolution. There's also, if we're talking about, like bacteria, for example, there's this amazing mechanism they have to just directly share genes with each other. It's called horizontal gene transfer, where they basically can shoot off particles of genes. They're called phages that can kind of infect other cells, and it's a way of a gene spreading directly from one organism to another.
Hmm. And part of what that obviously suggests is that there is no particularly there is that it kind of the it challenges the assumption that you have to have a male female for a reproductive cycle.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I should point out that when we're talking about male and female,
Hmm.
These are terms that refer to the size of the gametes that an organism produces. So if we have an organism that has multiple sexes, and if one of those sexes produce small gametes, and a gamete is the like sex cell that has the material that will be passed on, if one type, one part, some members of the sex produce small gametes and others produce large gametes, then we'll call the ones that produce small ones male and the ones that produce large ones female. And that's how biologists define what male and female are. And it's important to specify this definition is not based on chromosomes because different organisms have different kinds of chromosome systems. Um, it's not based on anatomy or morphology or behavior. All these things can kind of correlate in different ways from whether the organism produces small gametes or big gametes. But because, simple definitions are useful as a starting point, biologists decided, okay, we're going to call the ones that produce small gametes male and the ones that produce large gametes female. And because that's what we know from humans and other large mammals, right? That males produce sperm and females produce eggs. And that's our template that we then go and apply to the rest of living organisms.
Right. And that template's like really inaccurate.
Yeah, well, it's incomplete. And it doesn't correlate to a lot of other things. So, I mean, we know that, in humans, producing sperm or eggs doesn't necessarily correlate to our chromosomes, doesn't
Mm.
necessarily correlate to our behavior or our internal identity. All these things can be different, and they can be different in animals too. So, by this definition, of small versus big, we can see animals like, I believe it's the anglerfish that can change sex throughout its life, can go from male that produces small gametes and is actually small in size in that species to these large females. Um, I think I'm not totally clear on the details, but my understanding is that when a female dies, another male can grow and become female and take its place.
Hey, friends, after Ben and I recorded this episode, he sent a correction. The fish that changes sex is the clownfish, not the anglerfish. Okay, thanks. Now we're going to get back to the episode.
Right. And we're using these terms male and female, but they don't correspond to, what we normally think they mean in humans. They're just referring to different mating types.
Hmm. And so as you're looking at that, like, what does that tell you about queerness? So what does that tell you about like the nature of life?
Well, I mean, evolution finds so many ways to do everything, So evolution is
Mhm.
driven by reproduction. So organisms need to find some way to reproduce. But there's many, many different solutions to that problem. So, there's an entire species of fish, for example, they're called Amazon mollies that they the the entire species is only female or,
Mm.
female in the sense of having large gametes. Um, they mate with males of other species, but they produce their own offspring without using the genetic material from these other species. So they reproduce clonally. They just produce copies of themselves, but, that they also, mate with the males from other species, and somehow that kind of triggers their reproduction, but doesn't actually use any of the genetic material.
Hmm.
Um, so evolution finds, like life finds ways to reproduce itself, and evolution rewards that, or rewards the organisms that find ways to reproduce, which are very creative. And I mean, Um, like I said, like, I don't think we can draw straight lines from, any of these other organisms to humans in particular. But uh, it we can take inspiration that, the biological world is so vast and so variable in the ways that organisms both reproduce, but also just interact with each other. And they have sex for many many reasons other than reproduction, and we can get into that. Um, but yeah, I mean, there's no biological template that, for example, LGBT humans are violating. The
Mm,
the the rule is that, life is creative.
mm, mm. And that reproduction is important, but it's not the only reason for sexuality, and it's not the only reason for, um it's not the yeah, it's like the sex and yeah, so tell us a little bit, what do we know from the science and math and biology about about, like, the role of sexuality? So you mentioned it's not just about reproduction, even though reproduction is clearly very, very important in evolution.
Right, exactly. Yeah, obviously reproduction is important for a species to persist. But we see all kinds of organisms having sex, for reasons other than reproduction. There's organisms that have sex with the same sex. There's organisms that have sex with those outside of their species. There's organisms that masturbate. There's organisms that occasionally have been seen to have sex with dead individuals. So sex
Wow.
is I mean, it's like, sex is not only for reproduction, and that is not true just for humans, but it's true for, a wide variety of other species. Um,
Mm.
so I got into this question. This is my current research project. Um, uh From there's a 2019 paper by, Julia Monk et al. That really inspired me. It's called something like, "An Alternative Hypothesis for the Evolution of Same-Sex Behavior." And it took this question of, okay, so many, many different species are seen to have same-sex sexual behavior. So last count that I've seen, 1,500 species, over 1,500 have been documented to have instances of um, same sex, sex between two members of the same sex. So from a point of view of evolutionary theory, a lot of evolutionary biologists have kind of seen this and said, huh, why is that happening? Right? This doesn't produce offspring. And, our theory tells us that, producing offspring is the most important thing to do in evolution. So why is it that these organisms are doing this? It must be for some important reason, related to reproduction or survival, even though it doesn't produce offspring itself, right? So there's some
Sure.
hypotheses that, some of these instances of same-sex sexual behavior might be related to dominance, showing dominance, or practice for um, later opposite sex behavior, or maybe they're needed for social cohesion, social bonding, something like that. Um, this paper by Monk et al. Was kind of questioning the assumptions that underlie this whole line of research.
Mm,
So they were saying kind of two things. There were two implicit assumptions in this line of research. One of those assumptions is that, sexual behavior must be costly, right? It must carry some, fitness or metabolic cost to it. Um, because if it's not costly, then it's not a puzzle to explain, right? If having sex doesn't reduce my fitness in other ways, if it doesn't take away from my ability to find food, and reproduce later, then there's no puzzle to solve, right?
mm,
Organisms do a lot of things that aren't directly related to survival and reproduction, and if they don't cost the organism much to do, then why do we need a whole theory to explain it?
mm.
in a lot of instances of like play, for example, it might be related to survival, but it might just be organisms having fun, engaging in a behavior that doesn't cost them anything.
Mm. Mhm.
Um,
You have a lot of tiny organisms playing together.
Sure. I mean, and yeah, dolphins, lion cubs, whatever, they all engage in various kinds of play. Some of this might be
Mm.
kind of practice for later adult behaviors. I don't want to discount that, but also there's also kind of like, why not? If they don't have
Mhm.
a pressing need to survive and reproduce right at that moment, they might as well do something, right? Do we expect them to sit there and do nothing unless they're directly eating and reproducing? Like, um,
Mhm.
there's a lot of things that organisms can do. And then the other implicit assumption was that kind of the background, the evolutionary ancestors from which these modern day organisms evolved, must have been only engaging in different sex behavior, right? Because
Mhm.
again, if our evolutionary ancestors also engaged in same-sex behavior, and here I'm going all the way back to, marine invertebrates, then again, there's not really a problem to solve, right? Then if this behavior is kind of stuck around, and maybe it stuck around because it wasn't too costly, um, then it we wouldn't be surprised to find it in modern day animals.
Mhm. Mhm.
So yeah, I was really inspired by that line of thinking. And the research question I'm currently working on has to do with, well, in these early sexually reproducing organisms, I'm thinking about like, jellyfish and urchins, marine invertebrates. Um,
Mhm.
they likely didn't have the capacity to recognize each other based on sex, right? These organisms don't have very well developed, or they don't really have nervous systems at all, and they can sense their environment in some ways, but they don't have brains, for example. Um, and so, uh, the question is, were they really, seeking out different sexual partners? Or were they just finding members of their same species to mate with?
Mhm.
And if you happen to mate with someone of the same sex, well, it doesn't produce offspring, but as long as it doesn't cost you very much, um, you might as well. And to kind of add on to that, if you are trying to filter your sexual encounters to only the opposite sex, well, you might miss some opportunities because maybe your filter is not perfect. Maybe, if you can't reliably distinguish between same sex versus opposite sex, but you, for some reason, are really trying to avoid the same sex, you might, also reject some potential opposite sex reproductive partners.
It seems to be advantageous even to, like, being able to have sex with lots of different individuals,
Sure.
uh, because you might not know what sex they are, and because why not?
Yeah, exactly. And this is, I've talked about this in the context of these, early sexually reproducing animals. But we also see, for example, there's a deep sea squid species that the males have been observed to have sperm deposits on them laid there by other males. So there's clearly some sexual encounters between the same sex in these deep sea squids. And the thing about this, deep sea squids is that it's quite dark down there. Um,
Mhm.
they can't see very well in the deep ocean, and and there's also not very many of them around. It's a sparse population, may not encounter each other very often. And so, if you presume that these squids are really trying to only mate with the opposite sex and rejecting anyone who might be the same sex, well, that doesn't make much sense, right? makes much more sense to think they'll mate, with any other squid that comes along of their species. And half the time it could result in offspring.
And is there a sense that the squids might just find it pleasurable to be mating or to be engaged in sexual activity?
Sure, I think that can also be part of the explanation, right? Where, um, you know, every there's a reason that sex is fun, right? There's a reason that sex is pleasurable, and it's
Mhm.
because it, at least, in a significant fraction of the instances, leads to reproduction, right?
Uh-huh.
And so, I mean, to presume that, evolution is selecting for only opposite sex sexual behavior would have to assume that it's, only fun when it's the opposite sex and not fun or even distasteful when it's the same sex. And you can maybe, you can think about evolutionary stories where that might turn out to be the case, where, if the sex is very costly, then you don't want to, waste your energy or resources on a sex encounter. But um there's no reason to assume that evolution would select to make it unpleasurable, distasteful to
Mm,
engage in same-sex behavior.
mm, mhm. And so when you look at that, in your research is and that does that do you find it kind of so far at least, I know you're not I don't know if you're fully I know you're not fully finished with your research, but and what you're finding so far, do you find that it kind of emphasizes or proves this point that, same-sex behavior is actually part of our evolutionary heritage?
Yeah, so, what we've found is very interesting. We've essentially found that, um, there's 2 systems that could each evolve and each have a, strong story for why they might evolve. One of them would be a completely indiscriminate system where all members of the species have sex with all others, and the sexes are not very distinguishable. And, sometimes it results in reproduction and sometimes it doesn't. And
Mm.
then there's another regime, another kind of possible outcome where the sexes are very well distinguished and we only get encounters between the opposite sex. Right, so we can say, like, what leads to one outcome or the other. Um, so one of the factors is whether there's a cost to mating, right? If mating is very costly, in terms of, metabolic resources, then, it makes sense that animals would, save their energy for only opposite sex encounters, and so that would lead to a equilibrium of where we only get sex between the opposite sexes. Um, but if it's not very costly, then, you can easily get a kind of indiscriminate behavior where everyone has sex with everyone. Um,
Mm.
and then another interesting variable is the, kind of population density or the rate at which organisms encounter each other. We find that if it's very rare, then the kind of danger of missing a potential mating opportunity is too great, and so that kind of, you know, a sparse population with kind of few encounters overall actually leads to more indiscriminate sexual behavior.
Hmm. But,
So
yeah,
just
I
yeah.
would also imagine that in a sparse population that, um, people, like, are the individuals might just want connection with each other too, like, regardless of the mating of what comes out in terms of offspring, that yearning I wonder if that I don't know that I'm just projecting from a human perspective, but I wonder if there's also just a yearning for connection that can happen through sexuality.
Right. Well, I mean, so this gets back to the sociality question. So like like species differ widely in how sociable they are. So there's species that always live in community, and I think do yearn for that connection and are constantly engaging with each other. Like, dolphins, for example, are highly, highly social. They're always together, and they engage in lots of sex play, same sex and opposite sex. Um, But if we take, most bear species are pretty solitary. They live on their own, when they when the females have young, they, raise them and protect them, but other than that, they're mostly living on their own and doing their own thing. So I think the degree of sociality is another, like, huge variable that, it's evolution has just figured out a lot of different solutions to, which can be highly social or highly asocial.
I mean, I have to say, even within humans, I know individuals who are highly social. I know individuals who are much more bear-like and really prefer to spend much of their time alone. So,
For sure, right?
even within a species, I'm sure that there can be tremendous variations.
Yes.
Um,
Right, and when we see, individual personalities, I mean, we see these too,
yeah.
I mean, and anyone who's ever, had a pet knows that, right?
Mhm.
Or an animal companion, but also, there's some evidence that even spiders, some of them are more, risk averse and some of them are more, uh, um, uh, risk taking, so, yeah, I think, like, anytime we make a generalization about a species, it's like, actually, they are individuals, and, there is always variation in individual behavior.
Mhm. And part of what I hear you saying is, like, if you look evolutionary, there's many reasons why same sex as well as different sex, behavior might show up, and
Mhm.
that all those reasons are long term and have been around for eons and eons.
Right, exactly, right, so, in the
Which
dolphins
makes
and in, bonobos, for example, it seems pretty clear that sexuality plays an important social function, so
Mhm.
bonobos are seen to, resolve conflict via sex, um Yeah, so it can serve social functions, it can serve this kind of reproductive, the kind of like the same-sex behavior arising from just, having a broad filter with regard to reproduction. I do think the hypothesis of "it's just fun" can explain a lot and is a overlooked
Uh-huh.
explanation. So, all these things are in play, absolutely.
And all of that makes for a very queer evolutionary story.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something we have to, force upon the world. It's something that's there. It's there all around us. So the story of, understanding same-sex sexual behavior in animals is just the story of us looking for it. Because
Um,
everywhere, if we look closely enough, we tend to find it. Right. It was originally thought of as an aberration, but the list of species in which we're observing it just keeps growing. I know last year humpback whales were added to the list of species involving observed to engage in same-sex behavior. Um, so it's already there, and all we need to do is look for it and learn from it.
mm, mhm, and not maybe perhaps be a little bit less surprised.
Right. Yeah. I mean, um, well, it's interesting that, evolution as a theory for explaining life on Earth, came about during the Victorian era, right?
Mhm.
So there was, it's a pretty conservative era as far as, human social mores, and then Darwin had some fairly conservative ideas about male and female sex roles in the animal kingdom that turned out to be, gross overgeneralizations, true in some cases, but not in many others. And so,
Eh
yeah, we're all, we're learning quickly and rapidly, and, to my mind, it's just important to be open to the possibility of what's already there.
Yeah. I would I would I would hope that people would be. And it's true that, like, for most of the histories of these things, and I think I saw an article recently about, the importance of queer folk as scientists and mathematicians and others, like participating in these conversations because they see things that they ask questions or we ask questions that um, are not always asked by s- by people who aren't queer. Like kind of look at things a little bit differently.
Right. Yeah. It's a question of what you're open to seeing, what blinder, and obviously we all have blinders, right? We all have blind spots. We all have
Mhm.
things that we overlook, but that's exactly why it's important to have people from different backgrounds doing science because we will see different things. I don't
Mhm.
know. you know, Donna Haraway has this framework that um, we're always seeing from somewhere, so our knowledge is
Mhm.
always situated. We have a certain perspective as observers. There's no completely neutral observer, the way that science kind of pretends to be sometime. It's We see different things when we look from different vantage points. And so we
Mhm.
need these vantage points in order to really have a full understanding of what's out there in the world.
Mhm. We do, and that certainly fits with both the diversity and the messiness of evolution itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Ben. It's really cool to hear you kind of take us through some of these different pieces and kind of hopefully broaden some of our understandings both of evolution and what does it mean to be alive and be part of this living, breathing um, miracle of a planet.
Absolutely. This was so much fun. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much for listening to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. If you are enjoying what you are hearing, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. I am always happy to hear from you, dear listener, to continue finding ways to connect the disconnected and go deeper on your own journey of remembering and reenchanting with your communities, your organizations, and your families. I invite you to check out our courses and other community offerings via the Sequoia Summit Via website. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Though I must admit I spend much more time working with really amazing people than crafting social media. If you want to work with me one-on-one or bring me to speak at your organization or family office, you can find out more at sarajolena.com.